welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Elliot Waldman. Before we dive into today's interview, just a quick reminder to our listeners to tune in again on Friday for our editor's discussion, looking at the week's top headlines. Even as the coronavirus pandemic continues to monopolize newspaper headlines and TV chyrons all around the world, regular readers of WPR know well that the world hasn't stopped turning. To give one example, many long-running wars and conflicts show no sign of relenting around the world, even as some hostilities in areas hit by COVID-19 have paused momentarily for humanitarian ceasefires. The UN has called for a temporary halt to all conflicts. Meanwhile, a recent report by the International Crisis Group lays out the ways in which people in conflict-affected areas are more vulnerable to the coronavirus, but also some opportunities for peacemaking that might arise from it. Joining me now to dig into all of this is Richard Gowan, Crisis Group's UN Director and a longtime WPR contributor. Richard, welcome back to Trendlines.
Thank you very much. It's good to be back.
So UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has made a big push for a global ceasefire resolution in the Security Council, the aim being to press pause on violent conflict all around the world so that the international community can focus on the coronavirus pandemic. Bring us up to speed on those efforts, how far they've come, and what some of the remaining stumbling blocks are that you see.
So Guterres first made this call on the 23rd of March, over a month ago. And his proposal was that all armed groups and all governments in conflict should pause violence in the first instance to allow humanitarian access to conflict-affected areas which might be affected by the pandemic. Now, we thought at first that this might be a bit idealistic, but we were surprised because in the weeks that followed, we've seen armed groups as far apart as Colombia and the Philippines sign on to the UN ceasefire appeal. And even in Yemen, the Saudi-led coalition has at least promised to pause violence if Houthi rebel groups do likewise. And there's a real sense that the UN call has resonated with a wide range of armed groups, some of them probably very nervous about the disease, some of them probably signing on more for public relations reasons. The appeal is also resonating in the Security Council, and that's what I've been watching most closely. Because France, one of the permanent members of the Council, picked up the appeal pretty early on and has been pushing the other members of the Security Council to approve a resolution endorsing a 90-day humanitarian pause in conflicts worldwide. Now, this again sounds idealistic, and it has run into quite a bit of opposition, not least from the US and Russia, who were concerned that it might place some limits on their counterterrorism operations in the Middle East. But the French have been moving this ball forward very slowly, and it now looks like by the end of this week, or maybe the beginning of next week, so the first full week of May, the Security Council will pass a resolution endorsing a global COVID ceasefire. And although it's taken more of a month, that is a real success, I think, for Guterres, and also for the French.
So what are some obstacles you see still ahead for this effort? Is there anything that could yet derail it?
We're into the end game of negotiations right now, speaking on the 28th of April. It's possible that a text may actually be agreed as soon as tonight. The negotiations have been dragged out in part, as I say, because the US and Russia, and I think also the UK, were quite concerned that a blanket ceasefire resolution would place legal limits on counter-terror operations. But the US has been a spoiler more generally, and the US has been using this Security Council discussion to keep on raising the question of whether China should bear greater responsibility for COVID-19. Back in March, the US was even suggesting that any Security Council resolution should actually refer to COVID-19 as the Wuhan virus. They've pulled back on that a bit, but they've still tried to get some language embarrassing the Chinese into the text. And the US is also objecting to even quite banal language praising the World Health Organization. Now, that, of course, is related to President Trump's decision to freeze funding to the WHO. What's interesting is that in the last few days, it doesn't seem that the main diplomatic problems have been around the basic idea of a global ceasefire relating to COVID. They've actually been around these rather secondary issues of language on the disease. And that's quite interesting because normally you think that the big powers in the Security Council concentrate on geopolitics and conflict. Right at the moment, actually the US in particular is more bothered with questions about placing blame for the disease, probably for a domestic audience.
It seems like this is a play we've seen before from the Trump administration, given the lackluster response to the coronavirus domestically to try to deflect blame and try to get people looking elsewhere. Is that what's going on here?
Yes. The Trump administration has always been negative towards the UN. And of course, in the last few years, it's pulled out of UN arrangements like the Paris climate change deal and mechanisms like the Human Rights Council. The Trump administration has also been worried for some time that China is gaining too much influence in the UN. So it's not been particularly surprising that when you have a big global crisis, which the US is handling quite badly, that Trump looks to multilateral institutions to spread the blame. And, Trump is also really taking advantage of the fact that China is a potential scapegoat for the disease. And it's those dynamics, I think, largely driven by US domestic politics, which are complicating UN diplomacy. I mean, I would say there are genuine questions about the way the WHO has dealt with China and deferred to China over COVID-19, but Trump is clearly using this for his own agenda, rather than simply worrying about the probity of the WHO.
Clearly, this needs to be a big area of focus, and it is encouraging, as you say, that so many parties to conflicts worldwide have already signed on to this effort, because populations affected by war and conflict are more vulnerable to the spread of COVID-19, whether you're talking about camps for people who have been displaced by conflict, or even just the declining quality of healthcare facilities in conflict-ridden nations. But you and your colleagues at Crisis Group have also been monitoring how traditional conflict resolution and mediation efforts are being disrupted by the spread of the coronavirus. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Something that we highlighted back in late March when we were first writing about COVID was that the travel restrictions, simple movement restrictions associated with the pandemic would complicate the work of UN mediators and UN peacekeepers worldwide. And this has been a problem. UN officials in the Middle East simply haven't been able to travel around the region because of blocks on flights. And one UN peacekeeping force, the force in South Sudan, has really had to curtail its movements because a number of the peacekeepers themselves have turned out to have COVID-19. Now, the UN is very, very sensitive to any suggestion that its personnel could be spreading the disease. You will remember that some years ago, the UN was accused, I think pretty devastatingly, of having spread cholera in Haiti when a peacekeeping unit deployed carrying that disease from South Asia. Now, no one wants that to happen again. So COVID-19 is placing some pretty severe restrictions on what international peacemakers and peacekeepers can do. That said, a month on, we're quite impressed with the way that the UN has managed to work around these limitations. And we know that its envoy for Yemen, for example, has been working quite closely with the conflict parties to try and get a ceasefire there. We see UN officials and UN peacekeepers in Africa playing an important role, I think, in supporting relatively fragile governments prepare for the pandemic. So perhaps it's not quite as bad as we first feared.
In addition to the direct health-related impacts on global conflicts, how might the economic fallout and the global recession that's being triggered by COVID-19 fuel conflict and unrest around the world?
Well, this is a long-term source of concern. And from the beginning, crisis group has been arguing that the economic and political effects of COVID-19 will outlast the first acute phase of the disease. We are very concerned that the probably very severe recession, some say a depression, that is going to follow COVID-19 will affect fragile states and will be a source of very severe unrest in a lot of countries. It's even possible that in some parts of Africa where the disease has not actually been that lethal, the knock-on economic effects will prove to be worse. What we're concerned about is that fragile governments will be unable to manage the economic shocks following the pandemic. We're concerned that international aid donors, who will be struggling to find cash, won't be able to support those fragile governments. And then you are likely to see unrest, violence on the streets, political tension, and in some cases, governments, even governments that are not instinctively authoritarian, may conclude that their only response is to crack down and use authoritarian measures to keep control. And that's a process that we may see over a matter of months or even years from now. And we fear that that's going to be dominating a lot of our work as Crisis Group going through 2020 and into 2021.
You've been watching the UN for a long time now and had a chance to observe the multilateral system respond as well to the last financial crisis in 2008 and 2009 and efforts to recover from that. Would you say that the UN took some lessons from that crisis that it's now applying to the current recession?
It's been interesting and quite depressing to contrast the multilateral response both to the 2008 crisis, but also to the 2014 Ebola crisis with what we're seeing today. And I don't think this is really about the UN as an institution. It's actually more about the US as the predominant power in the multilateral system. In 2008 and then 2009, the George W. Bush administration and then the Obama administration both understood that they needed to marshal a global response to the sudden economic crisis. And that wasn't channeled through the UN. In fact, it was channeled primarily through the G20. But Bush, and then especially Obama, really used the G20 to frame a global strategy for dealing with the fallout from the crash. Similarly, in 2014, admittedly after quite a slow start, the Obama administration went to the UN to deal with the Ebola crisis in West Africa. And you had a Security Council resolution on Ebola, you had a General Assembly resolution on Ebola, the UN sent an emergency mission to West Africa. The US sort of really mastered that process. And lots of countries like China and even Cuba came on board offering medical supplies, offering doctors. So, twice within recent memory, we've actually seen pretty effective multilateral responses to global challenges. And the US was at their core both times. This time, the response has been nothing like so good. And I think a key reason for that is that the US simply hasn't been playing its role as the multilateral playmaker, if you will. As we were saying a few moments ago, President Trump has seemed more concerned with attacking the WHO and other multilateral institutions and using them as scapegoats for the COVID crisis than framing a compelling global response to this disease. Equally, China, which has been gaining influence in the UN, especially in the last 5 years or so, could have stepped forward to try and direct a multilateral response to COVID-19. But it hasn't really achieved that either. Instead, it's been focused more on offering bilateral aid to other affected countries. So it feels like there's a real vacuum at the heart of the multilateral response and UN response to COVID. Guterres has tried to step in, and I think he's been statesmanlike, talking about various aspects of the crisis, including the economic aspect. The French have tried very hard on a number of fronts to convene international groups to deal with this threat. But without the US and China, it's tough.
To sum up from what you're saying, it sounds like the UN and other international organizations, which are often maligned as slow-moving and sclerotic bureaucracies, are actually responding pretty well, and it's the member states mired in their competition and their bickering among one another that are hampering the response. Would you say that's right?
I think that's actually broadly fair, and I've even heard diplomats, national diplomats at the UN, make that comparison in very similar terms. It is fair to say that the WHO probably did make some mistakes in how it dealt with China in the first 6 weeks or 2 months of this year over the outbreak of the disease. It's also fair, I think, to say that quite a lot of UN officials didn't really grasp how big a challenge COVID was going to be in the first months of this year. I mean, I remember UN officials as late as mid-March saying that they really didn't think that the system had started to grapple with what COVID was going to mean for international cooperation. But something changed in early March, and I think that Guterres does deserve kudos for this. He did really start to raise the alarm and emphasize the need for a global response to the pandemic in the last 10 days of March. And following his lead, I've been really impressed to see the UN system work, frankly, faster and better than it normally does. And, I think, according to one statistic I saw, UN development teams in probably around 100 countries have been providing support to the host governments on how to respond to COVID. The World Food Programme is making a big push to get together a global logistics system to get food aid to those areas where the pandemic will affect food supplies. There's a real sense of activism around the UN system that has sometimes been lacking. I think in my remote conversations with UN officials that I do detect that many of them think that this is a make or break crisis for the international system that we have. If the current set of UN agencies cannot pull together a global response to COVID-19, then very frankly, governments are not going to continue to support them going into the future. They know this is a crucial moment for showing why the UN matters. And as I say, I think their efforts have been praiseworthy to date, rather in contrast to some of the more sort of petty and unpleasant diplomatic debates we've seen in New York.
It's an interesting point, especially because in the years leading up to the pandemic, we've seen so many political movements emerge around the world based on this idea that so-called globalism is a failed ideology and nationalism is the way to go, and the resurgence of this idea that the nation state is the primary actor and that multilateral institutions are limited. This almost seems like an opportunity to change that equation and flip it on its head.
I think so, and I think this is what Guterres in particular has seen. Antonio Guterres became UN Secretary-General a few weeks before Donald Trump became US President. And for the last 3 years or so, his focus has really been on trying to protect the system from the US and from other big powers who are taking multilateralism less seriously than before. Last year, in 2019, Guterres did start to develop a narrative about the importance of global cooperation in accelerating the fight against climate change. And it was interesting that, he managed to, I think, get some good global media attention and sort of connect with civil society talking about the importance of fighting climate change. And up until the pandemic, it seemed that he would treat global warming as the defining challenge of his tenure. That was something I wrote about for World Politics Review, I think in September last year, just after the annual General Assembly session. But whereas it seemed that Guterres was going to be a climate change Secretary General, if you will, he's now flipped into being a global health Secretary-General. And, the UN remains profoundly concerned about climate change. There's a lot of worry about how this pandemic is distracting from climate diplomacy. But in the short term, it's clear that managing the disease is the most sort of profound and immediate test that Guterres and everyone who works in his system have to face.
For a lot of national political leaders, too, it certainly seems like this pandemic is going to be the challenge that really defines their time in office. South Korean President Moon Jae-in, for instance, comes to mind. He'll be addressing the World Health Assembly next month, invited by the WHO to share some lessons from that country's response to the coronavirus. But another trend that you and your colleagues have been monitoring is the worrying concern that leaders could seek to exploit this crisis and use it to expand their powers undemocratically in a lot of cases, such as what we're seeing in Hungary. Is this something that we should be more concerned about?
This is something we raised in late March, and I would note that other organizations such as Human Rights Watch have sounded very similar alarms. I think there is a lot of reason to worry that unscrupulous political leaders and unscrupulous regimes will take advantage of COVID-19 to quash dissent. I mean, Hungary, where the government secured the power to rule by decree, has probably gained most attention, not least because it's inside the EU. But I think that our colleagues at Human Rights Watch calculated around 2 weeks ago that somewhere like 90 countries had adopted some form of emergency legal powers to deal with COVID. And the challenge for us is to distinguish between those that are taking on emergency powers, for good reasons because they think that it is necessary, and those which are using this as a cover for suppressing dissent. We've seen quite a few governments. I think Egypt was one, expelling journalists. We've seen governments banning public gatherings. That's something we saw in Russia. It's something we've seen in Algeria. And we've seen others postponing elections. And in every single case, you can be objective and you can say, well, yes, you need to postpone an election or you need to limit large mass protests because they are potential places where the disease could spread. But in some of the cases, we have pretty strong suspicions that there's a secondary political motive behind it.
Even as we all keep our eyes on these trends, there are also opportunities, as you've pointed out, not only for conflict resolution and peacemaking, but also for the multilateral system more broadly. What would you say some of the most important opportunities are going forward that we should look out for?
We do hope that this UN appeal for a global COVID ceasefire will create some space for conflict parties to set aside their differences, at least in the short term, and perhaps in some cases even, cease hostilities over a longer cycle. Since Guterres first made that call in late March, as I said, we've seen a lot of armed groups at least promise to observe ceasefires, and that's included armed groups in Syria. I believe that Shia militias in Iraq have significantly eased off attacks referring to COVID-19. We've seen a lot of armed groups in Africa and countries like Sudan follow a similar course. Now, in some cases, that's going to be very temporary, and we think that some armed groups which are hit badly by the disease may want to pause hostilities for a long time, but other armed groups may manage to avoid the worst of COVID-19 and go back to fighting pretty quickly. In a few places like Libya, armed groups have actually escalated conflict. Still, in those places where the ceasefire call is heard, we do hope that UN mediators and friendly governments will put their weight behind making peace stick, offering some aid incentives and other incentives to try and extend ceasefires and try and get longer peace negotiations going. So, that's one sliver of hope that Crisis Group has been exploring. I think more generally for the UN and also the World Bank and other financial institutions, the big challenge is going to be working out how you manage the economic recovery from COVID-19. And I think that the key hope must be that governments will accept the need to coordinate through forums like the G20 and with bodies like the World Bank and IMF to manage a more or less coordinated global recovery, which may take a matter of years. If there isn't that sort of coordination, and especially if trade flows remain significantly reduced for some years, we are very, very concerned about what that will do to weak economies and weak governments. And so I think it is crucial that big economies, big governments, for all their own domestic problems, accept the need for global coordination when it comes to the recovery phase economically.
Any final thoughts you'd like to leave us with, Richard, before we sign off?
I think while I've been watching this crisis play out, I've been thinking back a lot to Diplomatic Fallout, which was the column that I wrote for World Politics Review for about 6 or 7 years before joining Crisis Group. And it's been fascinating to sort of see some of the tensions and some of the fault lines, especially the fault lines between China and the US at the UN that I was identifying 5 or 6 years ago, really open up during this crisis. Crises shine a light on pre-existing flaws and tensions in the international system. We'd known for a while that, US unilateralism coupled with growing Chinese assertiveness in multilateral forums was, creating new frictions and new tensions that could accelerate. And now we've seen them accelerate. And so I do feel that this is the culmination to a period of decline in the multilateral system that I've recently written about for Crisis Group. I'd written about for you, and I'd written about for other think tanks like the European Council on Foreign Relations. So we did see the tensions that are so obvious today emerging. It's a pity we weren't able to nip them in the bud earlier. And looking ahead, we will have to see if we can advocate for the construction of a multilateral system that can contain the tensions between the 21st century's big powers. Because if this crisis highlights the fragmentation of multilateralism, then I'm very worried about what the next major global crisis will look like.
All right, Richard, thanks very much for joining us and sharing your thoughts.
Thank you very much indeed.
Richard Gowan is the UN Director at the International Crisis Group. If you'd like to comment on the discussion, ask a question, or even suggest a topic for a future episode, drop us a line at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. Trendlines is produced and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow him and WPR on Twitter. And while you're at it, don't forget to sign up for our free daily newsletter. It's the best way to keep up with what we're publishing, and you'll also get a code for a 25% discount off an annual subscription. To sign up, go to wpr.pub/trendlines. That's wpr.pub/trendlines. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week.